everyone. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me today I have
Nick Bevilacqua from Fast and Up.
And hi, everybody. Ray Wolfe here. I'm a partner and architect at Thinkspace Architecture, Planning, and Interior Design.
And Nick and Ray are joining us today because both their companies wrote a report called Wood Use in British Columbia Schools. And they're here to answer some questions about what exactly is in this report and what we have coming for us in the years ahead as far as wood use in schools. So I'll start with the sort of the background of the report. How did that come about in the first place?
Maybe I can jump in there, Nick. The Forestry Innovation Investment asked us to do an update to the report, and we did that sort of over the last year. And doing a review of the previous work and where the province is headed, it sort of forced us to look at what the report was for, who the audience was, and what were sort of the new trends and new opportunities with using wood and mass timber and various wood products in the education environment.
So what are some of the benefits of using wood in schools?
Yeah, I mean, other than it's a great structural material and obviously offers a lot of flexibility and things like that. It's a highly sustainable approach to building buildings and especially education facilities. It allows for great open planning. It allows for multi-story design. Often, I think in the past we've thought of using wood for smaller scale buildings, and you certainly can, but as we have more urban dense environments, we're finding we're going taller and taller with our schools, 3-4 story buildings, and wood is a very good product to be using that as your structure, but also for finishing in the building. Nick, did you have any other thoughts?
I mean, the only other thing I'd add that's, very specific to kind of schools is that, when we think about where schools are typically situated, they're, within residential neighborhoods, right? And one of the kind of nice benefits of wood construction that we've come to really appreciate over time is that when you're doing construction activities in a residential neighborhood, that can be quite disruptive to the surrounding community, right? And wood construction tends to be a lot less disruptive. It's much quieter. There's a lot, there's less trades on site. There's a lot less vehicles going through the neighborhood. It's just really well accommodated to, constructing a relatively large structure within a quiet neighborhood.
And so BC has been well known, at least within BC, and I'm sure otherwise, about using wood being wood forward, I guess is the best way to put it. Pushing to use it, obviously, there's SkyTrain stations and various other facilities. There's the Brock Commons, which is one of the tallest wood structures in the world. So how have they been pushing the boundaries of wood design and construction and using leading edge technologies?
I think one thing that we've kind of seen, relatively recently is that, the Ministry of Education, which is funding a lot of these school projects, they are becoming a much more kind of knowledgeable stakeholder, right? And so they're really understanding that the decision, how the decisions that they make kind of impact some of the initiatives that they're trying to push through on a, provincial scale, right? And so for a long time, they've been really trying to kind of tout the use of wood. And I think they've, over time come to realize that school buildings are, a very good opportunity to really kind of put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, and really encourage design teams to much more thoughtfully and intentionally try to get wood into schools, as opposed to just kind of being somewhat ambivalent about material usage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think we're starting to see the policies come together nicely with the market and with demand and with what school districts want to do as well, and designers want to do. There's new groups such as OMPTI, Office of Mass Timber Implementation, at a policy level, and as Nick was saying, you have Ministry of Education and also Treasury Board in our province who's asking the question: what are we doing for using the products we have in our current geography? But not only looking at it from a marketing perspective, but we should be using products that have a better approach to carbon and sustainability. And that's where I think wood is really come a long ways. And I think you kind of nailed it there at the beginning of the question. You said BC is at the front of things, and having been to Halifax with Nick and Alberta and looking at the different markets across Canada, I think BC's in a really unique position in terms of having the product, being able to make the mass timber products to build these schools. And you're right, Warren, we see them in SkyTrains, we see them in the tall mass timber residential. But what's unique, and I think about schools, is when we start hitting these higher occupancy levels of height, there's still assembly occupancy buildings, and that's where we're seeing shifts in the authority having jurisdiction entertaining and being okay with performance-based approaches to the building code, saying, you know what, wood is safe. It is safe.
Yeah.
And what are some of the advances in wood technology that are specifically being applied to schools?
I think in general, there's been a lot of advances to kind of the fabrication capabilities that have really helped with wood construction in schools, right? So, you mentioned Brock Commons that we kind of did a number of years ago. That was maybe the other end of the spectrum where you had this very rigorous sort of geometric design that was repeated and kind of, really kind of economize as much as we could, right? And that was working with, available panel sizes and stuff like that. When you get into school buildings, there's a lot of, number of different functions and kind of programming requirements that cause things to be a bit more kind of adaptive, right? And so that what that means is that you're not just kind of rinse and repeating the same panel over and over again. Structure that goes into a classroom is going to look very different than a structure that goes into a gym or a lab or things like that. And as the suppliers and manufacturers have become more sophisticated with their fabrication capabilities, they're able to kind of accommodate that, flexibility in what we need the structure to do relatively easily.
And I think, Nick, as well, the design teams are becoming more adept at creating the project spaces, the neighborhoods, the kind of communities out of wood that we might have previously done it in concrete or steel. And we're just getting better at taking the modules of the CLT panels or of the glulam beams and the structure to create those flexible neighborhoods that are really important for 21st century schools.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a lot less of this sort of uncharted territory when we sit down first at the design table and say, how are we going to tackle this? You're absolutely right, Ray. A lot of the consultants are already well equipped to kind of respond to the specific design constraints.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing is we're becoming more and more aware of how digital twinning and using our BIM modeling through the design stage is also being used by the manufacturers, and they're building their own digital models that then we can also leverage and review as part of the shop drawing stage. So there's a little bit more fluidity, I think, because of technology as design tools, not just the fabrication tools that we're seeing in the plants.
And Ray, you mentioned earlier about carbon footprints. And what are some of the benefits, I mean, are the obvious ones, of building with wood in terms of a carbon footprint?
Well, it's really it's the sequestering that you get, and that wood's done a really good job in the forest being the lungs for the earth and capturing that carbon. So there's the sequestering that's already happened, but once that product has reached its end of life or is now being used for another purpose, you're still storing that carbon, which is great for the environment. But then you're also your embodied carbon goes down, or that carbon that's being emitted to actually build the building itself is lower when you're using wood than it would be with steel or concrete.
The only other thing I'd add to that we've kind of come to understand as well, and this is more when you're getting into kind of full mass timber structures, the material itself has a pretty decent kind of natural insulation property. And so when you have kind of a complete CLT structure or something like that, it does a decently good job of kind of keeping the energy in itself as well, right? And so that is something that our mechanical colleagues can kind of take advantage of as they're kind of thinking about different HVAC systems. And I know from the architectural end, Ray and his team would kind of think about what kind of insulation we need to put on the outside of the building, right? And so there's some kind of nice knock-on benefits that you'll get out of the material as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Nick, and that sort of ties into the building envelope and how you're reducing your thermal bridging, which means you're reducing your energy use over the operational life of the building.
And another thing, another benefit of wood is the wellness in terms of health and biophilic benefits. And of course, we just came out, or we're not even out yet, but we're getting there, the COVID-19 pandemic. So what are some of those health benefits for wood? And especially, you just mentioned HVAC, ventilation as well.
Yeah, there's definitely a biophilic quality to seeing natural materials being used in schools. It just creates better learning environments, and the sort of the wellness levels are increased. So it's just that idea of incorporation of biofit principles into the classrooms. And, we're finding that clients are coming to us now, and their vision is to just be able to see and touch and have that wood be part of the experience of the school. And it's as simple as that. They want to be in that warm, rich environment that connects with nature. It's just we're human beings, and sometimes I think we forgot about that in the past, and that's at the forefront of some of our recent work and why clients want to use wood and expose it as much as possible.
The only other thing that we kind of bear in mind sometimes is it's sometimes easy to forget that when we're designing these school buildings, they're for young children, and really trying to create an environment for them that's conducive to learning and wellness, and kind of learning how to become part of a community, and that we have a structural material here that can kind of help us from that aspect as well. It starts to really feel like, why wouldn't we do it, right?
Yeah. And I think an important kind of aspect to the use of wood is understanding as a char rate. And in the work that Nick and I have been doing, we've been really adamant to make sure that the wood's exposed, even the structure. We're not concealing it, we're not covering it up. And you need to understand how to interpret the building code and leverage the building code in a performance-based way, so that you're not just covering those nice CLT ceilings with drywall to give it fire protection. You're using a different methodology that's not using encapsulation, but using that char rating on the wood. And that's where you're able to expose the beautiful qualities of the wood.
Now, in terms of cost considerations, I know CLT back when it was in the early adoption days, was probably more expensive because it was a less tested thing. But now I would assume it's cheaper or same price or equivalent, competitive, let's say, to any other way to build. But what are some of the cost considerations for a wood build school?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, when you kind of talk about the cost comparison to other materials, I think something that especially as kind of mass timber construction was more becoming on board in the community, it can be easy to think about, comparing this one structural material to another structural material and seeing that the mass timber was more expensive. But you got to kind of bear in mind that, we, like Ray mentioned, we really are trying to kind of expose that structure. And, when you kind of layer in some of the savings that you're going to get from not having to kind of, put surface treatments on the thing in both material and time, the faster erection speed, stuff like that. When you start looking at the cost more holistically, that's where you'll notice that it is really on par with the other structural materials. And Thinkspace and FastNet, we kind of joined forces for another report that we did under CWC's banner a number of years ago, where we looked at some different options, including cost vetting of those options, and the cost difference between primary structural materials, when you look at it holistically like that, is really negligible.
And I guess primarily an integrated project delivery model is used, and that helps with cost cutting as well, because there's more planning from the front end.
It partly helps with cost cutting. Yeah, I think the way I might say that more is that where you're really going to see benefits with this kind of construction that lends itself well to a heavy degree of prefabrication, is having that fabricator at the table, right? And so when you get into kind of more like an integrated project delivery kind of model, we can get a lot more stakeholders at the table earlier. And so we can sit with a fabricator, sit with a supplier, understand what their actual capabilities are, how we can factor that into the design, and really kind of economize in that way.
And we've been talking fairly abstractly here, but what are some of the different ways wood can be put into schools?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with some of the structural things, and then Ray, you can get into some of the non-structural. Yeah, does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a whole kind of palette of different kind of framing options that we're looking at when we talk about wood, and on the one end of the spectrum, that's kind of light wood frame construction. So 2x kind of material like you would see in any sort of single family residence or multi-res kind of building, right? That's kind of the one end of the gamut, and then you start getting more into kind of mass timber construction, and to a fullest extent, that can look like an entirely CLT structure, wherein you've got all of the walls and floor and roof plates fully comprised out of CLT. And then there are a number of different kind of hybrid options in between. So we can combine that light wood framing that I mentioned with mass timber elements. Ray and I were currently working on a school in Surrey right now that is combining some mass timber elements with light wood frame in that sort of way. And we've also incorporated some structural steel components as well, right? And the steel wood marriage tends to kind of work pretty well as well for buildings of this kind of size that we're talking about for schools, right? And so there's a lot of kind of different plugging and playing that you can do with all of these different timber structural systems out there.
Yeah, so certainly as Nick was pointing out, primary structure, but then your secondary structure, all your wall infills as we do planning and layouts, that's where we're able to use wood very easily. But then when you're looking at your finishes, using your gymnasium floors in wood, using wood on your walls for durability, using wood in different configurations in your ceilings for acoustics, right? And then even items such as millwork, which is very commonplace. So wood kind of has a home at every level and every stage and every kind of place in the building to some degree, and that's where we're constantly looking at how we can use it and leverage the wood in schools.
Okay, and what are a couple of case studies that you've both worked on in locally in Vancouver or the surrounding area?
Yeah, well, I think our latest project that's under construction right now is the Tadaloo School in Surrey, and that is a 3-story. I think it'll be BC's first 3-story hybrid mass timber 3-story interconnected atrium assembly occupant building, and that's where we are using a post and beam structure out of glulam's with a metal deck. It's a hybrid mass timber, and then we're using wood stud as our infill and also shear walls throughout the building. And that project's probably about another 20 months away from being, actually, no, less than that. We've been in construction for 9 months, so
we're well into the throes of construction.
We're well into
Maybe
the
let's
throes
say
of,
that,
of being built. Thinkspace also has a hybrid mass timber at Trinity Western University in Langley, which is a 4-story connected mass building, and Thinkspace also has another project on the island, which is going to be coming out tender soon, which will be a 4-story full mass timber CLT school. So we're certainly have projects out there that we're building, and very proud of them. And I know, Nick, you've got a few other ones as well that you've completed in the Lower Mainland.
Yeah, exactly. From our end, at FastNet, we just finished a couple with the Vancouver School Board, and so the two specifically are Bayview Elementary and Wakwanis Tashiakwam. Used to be called Sir Matthew Begbie. And those two schools, they both have just finished construction and been occupied, so they're kind of in full use now, and they're entirely CLT structures. So a little bit smaller than what we're kind of talking about with Tatalus. It doesn't have some of the code complexities that Ray kind of mentioned earlier, but because they were kind of fully within the confines of what could be allowed for combustible construction within the building code. On both of these schools, we really kind of took that mass timber construction as far as we could. And like I said, we ended up with these full CLT structures that are just wonderful spaces.
Yeah, and the actual Warren, the work that we did, the wood use in British Columbia schools, the practical guide, it does actually feature a number of these schools in case study kind of format. Yeah. So if you want to dig a little deeper, they're there.
What do you guys think we can expect from school building with wood in the future? How does it play out? What are some technologies on the horizon? What are some things you haven't tackled yet you would like to?
Well, I mean, you kind of mentioned it earlier, Ray. That we're getting both the school districts as well as the authorities having jurisdiction a bit more savvy, right? And so, it's through the kind of engineered solutions kind of process where we can go beyond what the code is currently contemplating, and that's certainly allowing us to get kind of bigger as well as more expressive, more exposed with our wood structures. And so now that door's kind of open to crack, I know both at the school district ends as well as design consultants such as ourselves, you're seeing a lot of excitement with just how far we can really kind of push the envelope of timber construction, and especially exposed mass timber construction in these kinds of buildings. So I think we're just starting to kind of see what's possible, honestly.
I think what would be nice is to see a little bit more consensus amongst authority having jurisdictions or different cities and municipalities in what their understanding is, first of all, of using mass timber in 3-4-story schools and assembly occupancy buildings. If we can start to see more consistency of what's accepted as a performance-based approach, I think we're going to definitely see wood definitely being one of the normal options just right across the board for building schools.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add too is, and we kind of mentioned the policy stuff earlier as well. I know, we're starting to see it where new schools, when they're getting into that kind of initial feasibility study stage, or even when they're being released as kind of full projects, there's now this mandate to kind of explore mass timber construction. And so, it's taken some time here, but like I mentioned earlier, I think the Ministry of Education is finally at the point where they're literally putting their money where their mouth is, where they're understanding if there's any kind of additional funding that needs to go into these schools to make sure that mass timber construction in some form can be realized, they're starting to pony up, and that's fantastic to see that level of commitment coming from the government.
Yeah. And I think the timing's perfect. I think the stars are aligning, and it's time. It's well overdue, and a lot of it has to do with the alignment of what we need to do for greenhouse gas reduction and building of buildings in general. And I think the alignment of all of those pieces that's why we're going to see more schools being built out of wood.
Okay, and finally, this is, I believe, a public report. Where can people go to see the report, and where can they go to see your respective companies' work? Because I'm sure you're showcasing it on your websites.
I know Naturally Wood has kind of been a launching pad for a lot of these other studies that we've done. If you kind of search timber in schools through the Naturally Wood website, they've got links to these projects we've been talking about, the studies that we released, all sorts of resources. And yeah, certainly we've got these kind of featured in our portfolio, www.faststep.com as well.
Yeah, and Thinkspace.ca, knowledge, wood use in British Columbia schools. Great.
Nick and Ray, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Warren. Great talking with you.